Welcome, everybody. I'm hoping to have a good conversation today about cybersecurity and medical devices. I thought I'd start with just a brief history of my own background, the company background, Mohamad, that sort of thing. So I'm the founder and president of CyberMed, started the company around 8 years ago. And we originally started as an Internet of Things development company. And I was like a solopreneur, just myself doing consulting. And one of the earliest clients that I got was a high security product. So it wasn't a medical device, but it was a device that required very high levels of cybersecurity. They were developing equipment to be used in various facilities that required security. And so they needed somebody to help implement it. And I knew that wasn't my strength. So I went and started looking for somebody. And I met Mohamad, who's on the call here. He's one of my two partners. And we met, we hit it off. I could tell he was brilliant, both in software development and cybersecurity. So I asked him to become a partner. His history is he was formerly the chief software architect at Motorola's global communication systems and two-way radios. And so he was responsible for global communication systems whose people's lives depended on them. So cybersecurity was top of mind. He's got a tremendous cybersecurity background. He did the first FIPS 140-2 certified in-browser crypto module and the first, software system to thwart Spectre and Meltdown, which are two major cybersecurity threats. So just tons of experience in that space. And so all along, we had this medical device practice, and then we had this security side. And about 7 years ago, we decided to really focus on medical devices, but we always retained that one client where we were always kind of pushing the envelope on cybersecurity. And then recently, last 2 years, really started focusing on helping medical device manufacturers make sure that their devices are secure and then make sure that they're compliant with FDA regulations. So that's just a little bit of our history. Why does cybersecurity matter? Why does it matter in medical devices? I was thinking we could do like a brief history in time, go back to Adam and Eve in the garden, eating the forbidden fruit, get kicked out. Then you've got Cain killing Abel, and we see that there's this global, eternal battle between good and evil. And if you fast forward then to the 1990s, you've got the internet being invented, World Wide Web, computers throughout the world being connected together. And now that evil doesn't require physical contact, right? So you've got the good side, you've got, Tommy in his basement in Ohio being able to chat with Pierre in Paris, and that's great. But then you've got Timmy, Tom's evil twin brother, being able to steal Pierre's, Lotus 123 files or something, or send him a virus. It's the 90s. And so you kind of see that those bad things that you could do previously requiring like physical co-location can now be done across the world. And you've got the advent of this new kind of security threat and crime that is related to cybersecurity. We oftentimes call it hacking, that kind of thing. So, that's the global context. And then, of course, in the 2000s and 2010s, we start to see a new paradigm, which is the connection of devices to the cloud and the connection of devices to each other. So you've got companies like Nest coming out with thermostats that connect to the cloud, Ring coming out with cameras. You've got Fitbit with pedometers. And, we take it for granted now, but it's really not that old. Like it's not that long ago that we didn't expect physical devices to be connected to the internet, but now they are. And medical devices, being a little bit of a laggard when it comes to technology, took some time, but before you knew it, you had glucose monitors connecting to iPhones and infusion pumps connecting to hospital networks and that sort of thing. So of course you've got dramatic improvements and benefits that come from that. It's great if you can monitor your loved one's glucose levels and get an alarm if levels are out of whack or something. But as you might imagine, you've now got greater threats around that. So that's the context of the world we're living in, and the context of where FDA and frankly Congress has really driven medical device manufacturers to have a greater sense of urgency around cybersecurity. So so far so good. Everybody can hear me and stuff. I don't want to talk for okay, good. All right, great. So why would somebody want to hack a device? Like why would a threat actor want to do that sort of thing? The obvious thing, of course, is money. And that comes in a couple of different ways. So one of them is ransomware. So where a hacker can hack into a server, let's say encrypt all the files, and then demand, let's say, Bitcoin payment. That's literally a case that I'm aware of happened to a medical device startup. So, you can see how threat actors can use cybersecurity attacks to demand ransom. But you've also got things like data theft, where healthcare data is a lot more valuable than even things like credit card and social security numbers. And then you've got things like nation state or terrorist attacks. So you can imagine a rogue country targeting critical infrastructure in the US, and the healthcare system is part of the critical infrastructure to cause harm. And then you could also have people who are attacking a specific person. So an interesting story, and this is actually one of the drivers of cybersecurity regulation in a way, was back in 2007 when Dick Cheney had to have an ICD implanted, so a defibrillator. So they actually required that the wireless connectivity of that ICD be disabled because of the concern that a terrorist could attack him, remotely through an attack. So there's a lot of reasons why threat actors might try to cause harm, or at least threaten to cause harm. And in response to that, both Congress and the FDA have pushed to have companies just implement better cybersecurity. So from a regulatory standpoint, you have regulations going, or at least guidance documents from FDA dating back to 2014. But I would say that the pedal hit the metal in 2023. Congress passed the Patch Act, which updated the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, added the section called Section 524B. So sometimes you'll hear that term being used in cybersecurity, which essentially said if you have a cyber device, and they gave a definition of that, then you have to do certain things. And they were a little bit vague about those things, but they gave FDA enforcement authority and interpretation latitude to essentially set the boundaries of what companies needed to do. FDA took that on, and within a few months in 2023 released the draft guidance around cybersecurity. And then by September of 2023, released the final guidance, with enforcement started in October of 2023. So it's been just under 2 years that FDA has had this guidance out, and that companies have to abide by. And it really applies to any device that has software. So they took the definition of cyber devices that's set forth in Section 524B, and they essentially expanded the scope. So they said, pretty much any device that has software and any conceivable means of connecting to the internet, whether on purpose or not on purpose. So you can imagine if you have a device and it has no interfaces, it still has to get programmed at the manufacturing facility. Well, the computer programming it could connect to the internet. So there's a conceivable path for it to connect to the internet. So essentially their view of it is, if your device has software, you have to follow this guidance document. And they took the 3 bullet points in 524B and expanded it to a little over a dozen documents, like 13 or 14, depending on how you count them, related to cybersecurity. So that's the context. As I mentioned, I run a company called CyberMed with Mohamad and another partner. And, we view our mission, we kind of have 3 pillars of our mission. So the first one is that we help medical device manufacturers understand their vulnerabilities, and we help them document those. So understand them so that they can fix them, right? So that they're launching products that are secure, and then document them so that they can submit to FDA and get cleared. So that's one pillar. The second one is doing the testing. So we do fuzz and penetration testing to help ensure that the device is in fact secure. And then the third pillar is community education. So even if companies aren't going to be clients of ours, we believe it's important for medical devices to be secure. And so we still want to help demystify cybersecurity for medical device manufacturers. And in that vein, one of the projects we've been working on for about 6 months is a book. So we launched a kind of a quick start guide as a starting point to help companies understand at a high level, but we wanted to do something more comprehensive. So we've been working on a cybersecurity book. And the approach we wanted to take to it was, rather than just writing it and launching it, we wanted to pre-launch it as an electronic book that allows commenting by the community. so that if we miss something, if you think we got something wrong, or if you think something's not clear, or if you're like, hey, I don't see a section talking about this, and that's an area that we struggle with. We want to get all that feedback. And over the course of the next month or so, we're going to incorporate a lot of that feedback and hopefully launch a better book that's helpful to the community. Our goal is not, this isn't really a profit center for us. Like when we do go to print, we plan to price it at a relatively low cost. And then for anybody who participates during this period of time, they'll get the free version of the electronic version. And, if it's something helpful, you'll be included in like an acknowledgements section of the book. So right at the front end of it, we want to acknowledge people who contributed. We kind of see this as a community project to really help the industry launch more secure products. So I'm going to pause there, see if there's any preliminary questions. And then what I'd like to do is show you the book. We've launched it as a web app. So there's a little web app that we designed and built that has like a way of navigating through the book and a way of commenting on the book so that we can get all that feedback and incorporate it. So I'll show you that. And I did see there's a question from Dorothy. What about a Bluetooth device that does not connect to the internet? It still applies. I mean, even if you don't have Bluetooth, honestly, like the guidance, if you look at the scope of the guidance document, it says medical device that has software functions, including firmware or programmable logic. So even if you just had like an FPGA or what's called a CPLD, it's like the scope is anything that has software. I find it amusing that they even have an example where they say, if all you have is a thermometer, right? Of course, we don't expect the same level of rigor than if we're talking about, an implanted ICD or something, or an infusion pump, but you still have to follow everything. So it's just, that's the position that FDA took. And so that's the world we live in. I'm not saying it's how I would do it or how you might want to do it, but it's how it is. But yeah, keep the questions coming, and I'll try to address as many as I can. All right, cool. So this is what your experience will be like. You'll create an account. You'll be brought to this page. On the left-hand side, I'm going to orient you to the experience of the book, and then we'll get into some of the details of the actual book. And my hope is to really only spend about 30 minutes on it, and then the rest of the time to just have a conversation, questions you might have, anybody on the call. I know we've got a lot of regulatory advisors, so I'd love to hear about what you're seeing out there, and really just sharing our content and our experience for the benefit of the group. So, all right, cool. So on the left-hand side, you're going to have a table of contents. The book is divided into 6 chapters. So the first one's an introduction of medical device cybersecurity. Chapter 2 is the regulatory history and framework. So looking not only at the guidance documents, but also at some of the standards that apply and some of the, even non-standards, non-guidance documents that exist in the community, like from like MITRE, that are helpful. And then we get into the more technical part of things. So, we always talk about there's like 3 main phases of cybersecurity in a product. There's pre-market architecture phase, where you're designing the system architecture. Then there's the implementation of the system, and then there's post-market. So we break that down into those 3 chapters, 3, 4, and 5. So planning and architecting for security, secure development, and then post-market responsibilities. And then chapter 6 is the eStar submission artifacts. So, we're trying not to be redundant with the other chapters, but saying, okay, now you're getting close to submission. How do you take all of that content that you've prepared as part of the process and then put it into the format that FDA is looking to see? So that's the gist of it. Okay, cool. So, chapter 1, I won't go too much into chapter 1 because it's essentially a lot of the stuff that I discussed in the intro presentation. But looking at chapter 2, here's what I was saying earlier. So at the heart of this are the 2 guidance documents that are still relevant. So there was a 2014 guidance document that was superseded by the 2023 guidance document. And, I should probably update, say 2025, because FDA did release an update to the guidance a few weeks ago. Honestly, like nothing really changed. It was really, and the intention was to try to clarify some things. I think in some ways they muddied the water a little bit, but the bottom line is that nothing really changed. So you've got that one, and then you got the 2016 guidance document that is still relevant, and it's more focused on post-market responsibilities. And then, I look at kind of the top of of the map, let's say a North Star is the ANSI AMI SW96, which Mohamad and I are both contributors to that. And that's the standard for medical device security. So prior to that, there were two TIRs. So TIR 57, which is Principles of Medical Device Security, and then Principles of Medical Device Security for Post-Market Risk Management. And SW96 partially supersedes TIR 57, but TIR 57 still has valuable things that are not in SW96. So they're all good references. And then kind of at the bottom of this, as sort of a foundation to all risk analysis in medical devices, is ISO 14971, which is the applicability of risk management to medical devices, particularly things related to safety. So even though they are different, they are related. And in fact, in both the guidance document and in SW96, there's a requirement to look at that interrelationship between security risks and safety risks. Okay. And then beyond that, you've got things like MITRE's playbook for threat modeling and medical devices. You've got MITRE's rubric for applying CVSS to medical devices. So CVSS, it's a scoring system for essentially prioritizing vulnerabilities so that you know where to focus. The MITRE attack framework, the MITRE defend knowledge graph, ISO 27001, which is kind of a foundational document related to security. And then one of my favorite documents, which is the Medical Device Health IT Joint Security Plan, which is a really helpful kind of community document that just goes into details in a very practical way on many of the things you need to do for cybersecurity. And then beyond that, you've got things like the NIST cybersecurity framework and et cetera. I won't go through all these, but we go through these in the book and provide some details. All right, so moving along from here, let me see if there's anything else in here that might be interesting. You can see the sub-chapters, so why the regulation, the evolution of FDA cybersecurity, key standards and their roles, so you kind of click some of that, see more details on what we're talking about. All right, and then getting into the more technical piece. So I'll pause here and take a little bit of time to talk about this diagram. I think it's a helpful diagram. So this is looking at the process of developing a secure system from an architecture standpoint. So, in normal medical device product development, you always think about user needs. You've got your planning and then you've got your user needs. And, but of course, your system requirements might also take into account business needs and other needs. But at the end, you create your system requirements and you architect your overall system based on those requirements. When you get to the software piece, so we're dividing it here between hardware and software. You can divide it differently, of course. But in the software subsystem, you would prepare your software requirements and then what we're calling a proposed software architecture. So there, just to say, look, this is going to be an iterative approach. So the first architecture that you come up with is probably not going to be the final one, because that architecture design leads to subsequent steps that cause you to revisit whether you're using the best approach. So you propose an architecture, and then you might ask the question, does the system and hardware architectures, or do the system and hardware architectures support the software architecture? So for example, if you're doing an embedded type of system and, I don't know, you need Bluetooth connectivity and the chip that your hardware team selected doesn't have that. Okay, well, then the system architecture does not, or the hardware architecture doesn't support your software. So, you might say, okay, well, can the software architecture be adjusted to work with that system or hardware? If the answer is yes, then you might choose to do that. Or if it's no, you probably bubble that up to the system architecture, system requirements, so that then the hardware people or whoever else needs to make that tweak. So that's just general product development. Eventually, you'll arrive at some software architecture. It's really still not final. It could still have changes. And this is where the security piece enters. Now, that's not to say you're not thinking about security at an even earlier stage. As you become more seasoned in this and you have people on your team who understand security, you're thinking about security even when you're doing your system requirements. But you're going to find new requirements as you go through the process. And so one of the tools that helps you come up with those new requirements is doing things like generating the security views for your architecture. So things like your global view and your patchability, those kinds of things, or your multi-patient harm view. And using those views, you can then kick off threat modeling. Now, threat modeling isn't a once event. Threat modeling really happens over the course of product development, but during the architecture phase, that's a good time to start that process. And you may discover a number of vulnerabilities in the system, or understand threats that could exist for the system. You would then try to quantify them and evaluate the risk. So there's a difference between estimating the risk and evaluating it. So estimating is like essentially trying to quantify it, and then you'll have some criteria for evaluating. Is it acceptable? Is it not acceptable? If it's not acceptable, you'll probably need to implement some controls to make it acceptable. And then you'd ask yourself, okay, is it a software control or is it not a software control? If it's not a software control, so as an example, there might be something in the instructions that you provide the user that they have to do. It's not something you're doing in the software, but it's instructions for the user. Or it might be that the hardware has to incorporate a crypto engine that's governed by the hardware design, not the software design. So you'll feed some of those controls back to the system level, and then some of those may come back to your software requirements. And you sort of operate in a couple of loops until you've got an architecture that is pretty solid. And then at that point, you would proceed to your software design and software testing. So there's other activities that aren't shown in this diagram, but at the architecture level, this is the kind of process you'd want to follow. I can pause here in case there's any burning questions, and then we can move on to some other stuff. Anything burning? Let me see in the comments.
There were a lot of questions.
Okay, cool. Let me see. All right. Well, it looks like Mohamad's been answering some of them, which is cool. That's good.
Jose, I have a question.
Yeah.
So let's say a medical device company is remediating a device, because most of the devices on the market had to go through this exercise. The question always comes, when is it enough? And they look to regulatory to be like, is this good enough? Regulatory cannot give you that answer. You have to almost provide that justification. So could you give some guidance here of where you feel in your experience, and Mohamad, obviously, please chime in, that is achieved? And it's like, you're telling us this is a cyclical over and over and over. And then the other follow-up question is, certain other ISO standards that come into the risk management. 14971 is the big umbrella one, but the other aspects, especially around software, get pulled into this too as part of cybersecurity.
Yeah, great questions, Angelina. So yeah, one of the things that is a little bit confusing in the guidance document, but it's really not that confusing, is FDA's requirement that a company provide reasonable assurance of cybersecurity. And they actually did a presentation about this after the release of the guidance document. And the summarized version of that is you provide all the documentation they request, and it's well prepared, right? Now, as to the question of like, when is it enough? That really boils down to, in this diagram, and then, this little box that says estimate and evaluate risk appears in many places, because over the course of the process, you're estimating the risk and you're evaluating the risk. So in your cybersecurity management plan, just like how you do in your risk management plan for 14971, you're going to establish some criteria, and you're going to say, when the risk is below this threshold, then it's acceptable, right? And so the short answer is it's enough when the risk levels are acceptable and you've properly documented them to show that they're acceptable. So I would say that's the gist of it. As to your other question about other regulations, another really good question. So there's a couple that come to mind right off the top of my head. So one of them would be 62304, right? So if you're doing software development, you should be following a process. And in fact, if I jump ahead to chapter 4, which is the implementation, one of the things we did is we borrowed from a diagram that's in 62304, like the classic V model, which is just like this V here. And we tried to add to it, like, where in the V model of 62304 does cybersecurity fit in? So, like in that software development process, as an example, 62304 tells you should have you should have a planning document, and you should have software requirements and software architecture and software design and that sort of thing. Well, as you're doing the software architecture, you would then put together those security architecture views and do your threat modeling and risk estimation. And that might lead to you going through another cycle where you update those requirements, like what we talked about at the architecture level. And then at the implementation level, you're pulling in new tools like software bill of materials analysis. And same thing. So as I was saying earlier, like this little box that says estimate and evaluate risk, you see it here in the architecture, you see it here in the SBOM analysis, you see it over here in the, when you do your penetration testing and your fuzz testing, there's different times during the development process where you're going to see these vulnerabilities or these risks, and you're always going to evaluate them and determine if they're acceptable. So there's going to be definitely a tight link between software development 62304 and cybersecurity. The other one that comes to mind is usability, right? So 62366. In fact, when you look at SW96 and TIR 57, they actually bring up usability or human factors engineering as like a parallel or almost like as a precedent for what they're doing with cybersecurity, in the sense that classic safety risk management is predicated on this idea of like, stuff happens, right? And like failures occur, and they might have some probability and some severity to the harms that are caused, right? But in usability, it's not like some random thing. It's the fact that if you design usability poorly, you might drive confusion, which could lead to hazardous situations. So there came a time where people recognized that the way you look at risks associated with usability just needs to be a little bit different than how you look at it for standard, failures, just like component failures, let's say. That frame of mind carries over to cybersecurity, because cybersecurity risk analysis is also different. So in cybersecurity, you're not thinking of a random event that has some probability. You're thinking of a threat actor purposefully choosing to look for vulnerabilities in your system and exploit them to cause harm. And so that's one way in which usability and cybersecurity relate. The other way is that as you're implementing controls for cybersecurity, you have to incorporate and bring in your team that has expertise in human factors and your team that has expertise in safety, because you might inadvertently create new risks related to something like usability. So, imagine, for example, if you've got a surgical instrument that's used in an emergency situation, and one of your security features is that you enter your password and it locks you out after 10 minutes of inactivity. Well, you can imagine how that could have significant usability implications when a doctor's in the middle of trying to perform surgery and the security control causes them to have to go back and put in their password and they're already gloved up and stuff. So, it's just kind of like an example, but you have to consider how all these things interact with each other. Does that make sense?
There's been a couple of questions, Jose, on
Sure.
guidances and overlaps and guidances and standards. And so, this is something that we deal with all the time, which is the different standards. 81001-5, for instance, is actually older. It was published in 2021. Is actually older than the 2023 guidance from FDA. The FDA borrows from that, enhances it. We actually just voted on reviewing the IEC standard again, and it's probably going to go through another update in the next year or so. So these standards and guidances will constantly piggyback, and they'll overlap, and then they'll put new additions, and then they'll change. For the most part, they also target a little bit different areas. So some of the standards and guidances are more targeted to particular aspects of things. So again, I think you just have to look at all of them as a totality and try to see how they all apply to you, to your situation. There's always little holes that you have to close, but there's no perfect answer, unfortunately, and there's no one guidance that sort of supersedes all of them or one standard that encompasses everything. It's just a way of life that you've got these multiple standards and guidances from different organizations, and you have to figure out how to make them all work together.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, that's part of the purpose of the book is we're trying to kind of pull in from these various places and provide, kind of instructions. I'm not saying read the book and you don't need to read everything else. Like you still need to, like this isn't, this has no enforcement power, but the idea was to try to pull in all those concepts and then make a practical guide to how you would go about this. I see there's a question too about should we perform risk assessment for all findings identified through SAST and DAST? And, I mean, I'd say the answer is yes. Like really any vulnerabilities that you discover, whether they be through, your threat modeling, like doing like a stride type of analysis, or whether they be from your static application safety testing or your dynamic testing or fuzz testing or penetration testing or SBOM analysis. Like these are all different tools. You're trying to be comprehensive, right? So it's almost like if you're building a ship and it's got 30 holes, right? It's like, how many do we have to patch up? Well, probably all of them. So you're kind of looking for different tools to see like, this one helps us at the architecture phase to understand those vulnerabilities. And now this one helps us in the SBOM phase. And I'll speak to that in a minute. And this one, so every vulnerability they discover, you have to evaluate and consider what impact it could have.
If you go back to what Jose said earlier about being comprehensive and part of this, and again, and this is a little bit FDA centric, but I think it applies in general, of this reasonable assuredness of cybersecurity. It's certainly preferable to document and then rationalize and accept than it is to simply throw away and don't document. If you just simply ignore things, there's a chance that it can be found and someone will come back and say, why didn't you think of this? So we tend to take that sort of more comprehensive view of saying, just capture what you find, be thorough, analyze it, and then rationalize it. And to the earlier question that was asked about when's enough? Well, you set your criteria, you set what your acceptability criteria are, and then as long as you are meeting those acceptable criteria, you're fine. So fine in the sense that you at least have some justification as to why you're doing it.
Yeah. I mean, obviously they need to be reasonable, right? FDA will look at that. And if you're setting the bar too low, you'll get pushback. But if you set a reasonable bar, as Mohamad's saying, like that's the reason you always do the security, analysis, estimation and analysis is to determine if you're at an acceptable level.
I'll give you one data point just very recently. So I don't know how many people are aware of this or not. I'll just bring it up that FDA are now employing automated tooling to basically analyze submissions. I'm pretty sure they're doing it very specifically in cybersecurity areas because they are able to pick out very tiny discrepancies in documentation. So they are not just hand waving on this. They appear to be very targeted and looking at the documentation being submitted and asking very, very, very pointed questions, towards that. So if you don't do a thorough job, there's probably a very good chance that they're going to use it. Yes, they're using AI. It's called ELSA. It actually came online early. It was targeted to come on late in June, and they actually deployed it 2nd of June. And we've already had reviews go through with ELSA, and I've seen the responses. So they're extremely detailed. They're literally drilling down on individual sentences and saying like, why are you claiming this? Why is this okay? And so you need to be thorough.
But isn't ELSA like also hallucinating a little bit?
Might be.
I think they all do. I actually found the questions that were being and it's changed the dynamic because we were literally going back and forth and getting replies within a day. I mean, we would get a question, we would submit a response, and the next day we'd already have a response back. So it's very rapid now. I found it
very similar to Mohamad that the questions and the responses all seem to mirror exactly what you got in the last response. So
similar, yes.
Yeah, we've seen that too. Clients will come to us like after they've submitted and they get back a list of deficiencies. And and
you're like, I just got this exact list, Jessica Lamb. What's going on?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, and you would imagine that to be the case because, even before when it was human reviewers, you know, it was very clear they had a checklist.
Human reviewers, yeah.
Yeah, they had a checklist. Now with ELSA, it's even more automated. So, I mean, there's pros and cons to that, right? I think one of the potential downsides, you know, as Angelina alluded or mentioned, is, you know, you're going to have the AI hallucinate or maybe misunderstand something or whatever else. Fine, you get an opportunity to respond to that. So, you know, it's a very minimal downside in my view. The upside is you get responses very quickly, right? So, you know, like we said, we've had clients who come to us and they're like, we submitted it on Tuesday, and by Friday we had, you know, this list of deficiencies, and we're like, okay, let's dig into it, see how we can help. So yeah, it's very clear that they're implementing it.
Are you
Cool.
getting the sense that the human reviewers are giving any oversight to the ELSA output before forwarding it on to you, or not?
I'm not
Very
sure.
hard to say.
No, Carrie, you probably see more of these than
Yeah.
we do, just general responses. What's your take?
I mean, well, when you call it on it, all of a sudden you do. During their phone calls, they kind of had a few where you call them out on it during the phone call, and then they're kind of like, oh, you know, and then you get the human response. But that's been I have had a couple in the last couple of weeks where they've kind of all of a sudden, well, we'll get right back to you. And then it seems to take a couple of weeks to get the human response. And then you get the old fashioned.
Yeah, that's kind of the fear with
Because
it.
they're green,
Yeah.
as you know, right now, all the reviewers,
It's
Lisa, right now are pretty
big problem.
So
Yeah.
that would actually, I mean, that would support, I mean, my view would be is that what you're getting as the initial responses probably are not human screened. It's the
correct.
the tool is sending them right back.
And the output is the exact response you just got on the same product code.
Yeah,
and I'm guessing you're
found,
seeing a lot more questions coming out from it.
Yes. If I compare submissions earlier than June to what we were seeing in the June, you know, through June and into July, they're far more questions and far more detailed.
And are there themes that are coming out in those?
I would say the theme, well, if there is a theme, well, I'm going to give you the theme from the perspective of what I found as the answer that stops more questions. How about that, right? So what, as Carrie said, if you answer insufficiently, you're going to get the same question again. And I think the answer to that is you have to be assertive and very specifically make it clear what the safety and efficacy, considerations are for whatever issue is being brought up. I think you have to frame things. I found that framing things in those terms is what it's looking for as an answer. It doesn't want like just hand waving. It won't accept just, vague answers. If you answer in a vague way, it'll just ask you again. It wants a sort of definitive, assertive answer.
And the way to like prevent a lot of that is
but
to just be rigorous in your original submission, right? So just have a
to
good
point
submission.
it wants you to hand it to them in a silver platter and point it, give it to you. They're not looking through the submissions. I mean, that's the whole point of E-Star.
Hear me? I'm sorry, because I wanted to jump in quickly. Are you able to hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I just wanted to kind of bring a little bit of not necessarily devil's advocacy here, but a little bit of balance maybe to this conversation. So recall, not too long ago when we were all complaining that reviewers gave us questions that weren't even related to our devices, or reviewers would respond back with the same questions they'd already asked us. I would argue that reviewers themselves, pre-AI, hallucinated. So I hesitate a little bit. I see a lot of alarm and a lot of hands in the air about, oh my God, FDA is going to AI. And I respect that. I respect the concern, but I don't think it's extreme. FDA, current administration, whatever it is, FDA is built of intelligent people. Intelligent people make mistakes. AI makes mistakes. And for me, somebody who sat through 2 years waiting for an FDA clearance because the reviewers just kind of kept shuffling it on and off. If I get AI answers within a week or two, even if they're wrong and I can call them on it and get somebody's attention, it's a win. So I know that I am biased towards AI, but I don't want to see us in industry over-indexing on this caution and this, oh my gosh, this is not right. It can't be, there's not ready. I feel like we need to support it and we need to help FDA move it forward in a positive direction. Because I hear what you guys are saying and it's absolutely legitimate, but it's a step forward and it's positive. And we had complaints about FDA before AI. So anyway, not to call
Well, no,
any.
I mean, I know on our end, we're definitely in agreement there, Monica, and that's our position too. I'd rather, I mean, the same exact line of reasoning, right? It's like AI hallucinates. Yeah, humans make mistakes too,
Right.
but if it gives me the answer rapidly and it's like 95% good, then we know what to address. And it's the same kind of thing from a submission strategy standpoint. It's like, follow the process correctly, document it well, and then submit it. And yeah, they might come back to you they're going to come back with fewer questions if you did a good job. And if you did a good job, again, like what matters is like the bones, right? That the thing is actually properly designed and secured. Because if FDA, whether it's a human or AI, comes back with a question and you did things right, all you have to do is explain it, right? The nightmare scenario is when you didn't do things right and they come back with a question and it's a legitimate concern that you've got a vulnerability that you haven't properly addressed. That's the nightmare scenario, because then it's like you're not going to be able to give them an excuse. You're going to have to go back and re-architect your system, redo the, whatever, the encryption, your authentication, your whatever thing you missed,
Right.
potentially probably redo your verification testing, redo your pen testing. God forbid, hopefully you don't have to redo your usability or your clinicals. But that's the real risk. So it's like, make sure you follow the process well so your system is
Right.
actually secure.
And that scenario, absolutely 100% true. But if you've got a problem like that, it should be caught, whether it's AI or reviewer. So yeah, totally
No doubt
aligned
about
on that.
In fact, you want it caught, because the last thing you want is for something to get through FDA and get cleared, and then we have a problem in the field. That's the last thing you want to happen.
Yep.
So, I take FDA, I mean, it's almost like how I deal with my building department. I take FDA as being a gatekeeper. That their purpose there is to ensure that there aren't problems in the field. Now, it may be a little painful sometimes, to get through reviews, et cetera, but I think the spirit of it is the right thing, which is they're trying to prevent failures in the field. That's ultimately their goal.
Yeah, good stuff. Good discussion. I'm glad we're seeing it. And I know we've got a few more questions. Let me wrap up just a couple things here, and then I'll shut down the screen and let's just have a good conversation about it. Just a really quick thing that I realized I didn't show you guys, but as you're looking through this, by the way, the link is right up here. So it's book.cybermed.ai. You don't need the dashboard, just the book.cybermed.ai. And that will allow you to register and then start doing it. And then in the document, let's see, you'll see kind of how, like, as you hover over text, it highlights. That allows you to just click and then leave a comment like, this is confusing, add more details, right? And then that'll get added here and we'll be able to see everybody's comments. And again, the purpose of this is to really take your feedback and hopefully at the end have something that's better. I won't go into the details of this. You'll get a chance. In the eStar submission artifacts, we try to break down the various artifacts and just give you tips on things that we've learned having gone through this. Kind of from like, when you're developing it versus when you're submitting it, what are some extra things you'll want to look at? As an example, like you'll want to make sure you have sufficient detail. So this is the kind of thing that could get flagged. Like if you're just saying, okay, an attacker could spoof authentication messages. Like, well, when you're submitting, you want to make sure you say, okay, just provide more details, right? So authentication spoofing leading to unauthorized therapy changes. An attacker could craft a fake authentication message to bypass user verification. What's the clinical impact? What's the likelihood? Those kinds of things. So just make sure that you have good details and good traceability and that sort of thing. So I'll stop there. And then yeah, let's have the conversations. I'd love to hear also from other people who've done recent submissions and some of the things that you're seeing or some additional questions you might have.
Hi, Jose. This is Fred. Thanks
Fred.
for the conversation. It's great. So I just wanted to go back to the submission strategy point that you were making, right? And I'm curious about your experience because obviously, you know, I've gone through submissions and especially recently, not so recently, because obviously after June, things have changed a little bit. But more importantly, when do you think is it time to do a submission when it comes to, like, you know, preparing that cybersecurity documentation package just being enough to submit, as opposed to just wait until you completely, you know, validate and have every single documentation complete? So when do you think, you know, it's the right time, you know, so that you could just kind of like strategize to maybe assure like an earlier clearance, if you know what I mean?
Yeah. So, I mean, look, from a cybersecurity standpoint, you'll want to make sure that you complete everything that's required up to and including your penetration testing and fuzz testing, right? So at the system level, you know, we didn't cover that here, but it's in the book. You'll want to do fuzz and pen testing of the system to make sure, like, any final vulnerabilities that you haven't caught through all of your other processes, that hopefully you catch them at that point. So at minimum, you need to have that. Beyond that, kind of like at a more global strategy, I know we've got some awesome experts here, Angelina and, you know, Carrie and others, who would do a lot of more submissions. We don't do regulatory submissions. We just focus on cybersecurity. Well, you know, if we get clients that need that help, we refer to them to other experts like that are on this call. But yeah, from a cybersecurity standpoint, you know, make sure you've got all your documentation ready, make sure you finalize all your testing and that your device is secure, that you've got evidence that it is in fact secure. Beyond that, I don't know, Carrie, what do you think in terms of strategy of when to submit?
I mean, there's many strategies that just, you have to have all of your documentation ready. You know, it depends on the size of your company and if it's the risks and when to go. You know, there's a lot of smaller companies that'll end up doing your design history file while your submission's in the queue to get everything else ready to go to market. I don't know.
I think true, you want to
Yeah.
create a reputation with the agency, and
Right.
having that reputation with the agency builds that trust, even if there's an AI bot giving you deficiencies. So my rule of thumb here is, are you set up for success that should you get any sort of deficiencies does not derail the business completely? That is the rule of thumb here for me. So if you get an AI letter that you say, gosh, we took this risk and now it's going to be 6 months for us to fix that, that's not a good reg strategy. You should
No.
never have a reg strategy like
You-
that. But there are businesses that want to do that, right? They're like, just submit it. We'll deal with the questions later. You have to be savvy enough to go, where is that risk and how derailing will it be to the actual submission and to your reputation to the agency? It is key.
A lot of agency or a lot of companies want to get it in for their stockholders, just to say we submitted it, so their stockholders are, you know, say we've submitted it, and yet the device isn't ready to go. They're still in the process of doing their 60601 testing, and then they'll, you know, but you need, the way the eStar is set up, you have to have all your testing done now, or it's going to get kicked back and you're going to get a deficiency letter, and you have 180 days to submit. And if you wait till the end of it, you know, you're going to get an NSE, non-significant equivalence letter, and you're going to have to resubmit. So
There's another question here too on kind of submission of devices. So I'll tell you a quick story. One of our clients has a device, or still has a device on the market that had been cleared like 5 years ago, and they got new clinical data that supported an expanded indication, and so they submitted that to FDA, and FDA came back with 14 cybersecurity deficiencies because, you know, in their original submission, it was before that October 2023 deadline. So just be aware that just because your device is cleared doesn't mean you're good to go. If you ever have to go back to FDA for any reason whatsoever, at that point, they're going to require all of the cybersecurity documentation. So it's not like this grandfathered notion of like, okay, you're in the clear. You still, and frankly, this is all stuff you should do. Like this is stuff that's important to do to make sure your device is secure. So putting aside the requirements from FDA, you want to make sure that you're doing this stuff so that your system is secure. So I hope that answered your question. Who was that? Matt Bontrager, I think. All right.
I want to call either Lisa or Monica into the reg discussion because they're seasoned as well. And personally, they're both my mentors.
I mean,
Oh.
just the one thing that I was going to interject there to build off of what you had said, Angelina, was in considering when to submit, think about what are the potential questions that the agency is going to have. So you should know before you submit, what are your potential downfalls? What are the warts that they might ask a question about? And if they did ask a question about it, what is it going to take to respond to that? And as Carrie said, if they do ask a question, you have 180 days to respond. And so if the response isn't able to happen in that time frame, that one's not a good risk to take. So absolutely get that duck back in a row before that submission happens. Jose was absolutely right. Having your existing clearance, changing that device doesn't grandfather you from the updated requirements. And that's something that I see often with people with biocompatibility. Another great example. Where people maybe haven't changed things, but the standards continue to update. And as soon as you put a new submission in, now you've got to react to what has changed out there. And that's a good thing for all of us, because even though we're industry, we also all are patients. So we want good product to get out there. And I think Monica had said it really well. FDA is out there trying to do a great job. And, going back to the conversation about the ELSA tool, our Monica and I both serve on the Twin Cities chapter for RAPS. And earlier this year, when the first round of cuts happened to FDA, we led a session to support the FDA people who had been cut. We've been trying to support them throughout the year, and we are out there. We're trying to find ways to support FDA. I think the use of AI is one of those great ways to help the review staff be more efficient. There will be some growing pains, as with any change that happens. I'm encouraged that it is kind of a closed system, that it's only being trained on FDA documents. So, I'm sure there are some hallucinations. I expect those to be minimized because of that. But, I ultimately expect that will be a positive thing moving forward. We do have an issue with some green reviewers at this point, and we'll always have an issue with some green reviewers. We have tactics to deal with that, but we're a complete ecosystem. We need to all work together. I'll get off my soapbox. Jose, one question I had for you is, when you were talking about your mission, it's clear that you guys support the testing, documentation. It's clear that you guys have been involved in helping with some remediation of issues from FDA. Do you guys get involved in all of the documentation for cybersecurity?
Yeah.
For companies in all the 1314 documents?
Yep. I mean, in fact, an engagement with us, we usually prepare all the documentation. So our approach is
fantastic.
Our team is made up of like seasoned software and cybersecurity architects. So the approach is we come in, we learn your system very quickly, we put together the security architecture views, and then we go through a process where we do the, we do the threat modeling, the risk assessment, everything. So yeah, it's pretty white glove. So yeah, I mean, definitely if anybody on the call needs help with that, please reach out. And I know Sean has on this call, likes to have an AI minute at the end. I told him I'd be happy to share kind of one of my little tricks that I like to use AI. I use all of them for many things. And, kind of a fun trick, if you haven't created diagrams with AI, is to tell it to create a diagram. So there's a couple of different scripting diagramming languages like UML and Mermaid and a couple of others, D3.js. So you can tell it something like, all right, here's another tip. I use a tool called Whisperflow, and I'll show you what that looks like. So create a diagram using Mermaid that lays out design controls for medical devices in a straightforward way. Okay, cool. So it's like text to or voice to text. That works really nicely. And then what you can see is, here I'm using Claude, to an earlier point made that they're using a closed system. Different AIs kind of tend to have different levels of security or at least assurances that it's not going to leak out into the world or train the models on it. But, here's like an example. Now this diagram is fairly complex, kind of hard to read. So you can tell it, right? This is too complicated. Give me a simpler version. And we'll hopefully simplify it for us. There we go. So now, it's telling us design controls, design inputs, review. Now, this doesn't guarantee the answers are right. I like to say that AI has brought the term "I know enough to be dangerous" to a whole different level, right? Where it's like you really need experts that are looking at the outputs and that sort of thing. But here it is. It's telling you, plan, input, output, review, verify, validate, transfer, etc. So pretty good. You can tell it to do the same thing with things like UML or draw.io, which is another one I like. So something to play around with for AI. Yeah, and with that, thank you guys for joining.